And I'm glad to be with you all this morning for this third session of the Mastering Mobility series on driving change. And this morning, we will have our hands on the Mobilise Your City Paratransit Toolkit to explore a bit more together what are the different tools and how to use them. I think we can slowly start into this new session that will be lasting for an hour. And just to recall, this training is developed by Mobilise Your City with the support of several donors and in collaboration with Kodatu. In case you would be interested, this session can also be replicated, so feel free to ask the Mobilise Your City team by checking the website, accessing it through the QR code on the screen, or directly in the chat box with the link that is being provided. Also, some general notes on how this session will be organized. So today is a bit particular because it will be an interactive session. So the session will be recorded. You can choose when you want to speak, whether or not you want to appear on the screen by switching on or off your camera. For your information, the session will be afterwards uploaded to our YouTube channel. So make sure that you're willing to appear on the channel, and we will ask you to keep muted unless you want to speak, and then you can either use your microphone or also, if you would rather, use the chat box to make any comment or questions. And as I was mentioning, so this session is part of our whole series that is representative of the interest of Mobilise Your City on the paratransit sector that has been showing through continuous activity on paratransit toolkit and activities. There is also an opportunity for us during this series of webinars to mention the fact that the Paratransit Toolkit has been relaunched and you can now access 4 different tools in English. So you can access it on Mobilise Your City website and you will find a link to 4 different tools. The first one will present you with the main characteristic of the sector worldwide. In the second tool, you will have different questions that you can ask when you want to conduct a diagnosis of the paratransit sector in your city. And the third tool will provide you with information and types of action that you can implement in case you would like to implement a reform on the paratransit sector. And you will find study cases in the fourth tool based on experiences that have been implemented across the world over the past years. We will today dedicate more time to the different tools of the Paratransit Toolkit for you to get more familiar with it and see how you can actually use it in your own context. Beside the toolkit, as I was mentioning before, this is the third and final session of a three-part webinar that started 2 weeks ago, with the first session that was dedicated to the crucial role of the paratransit in most of our cities, and trying to also emphasize the connection between the paratransit sector and how it can be used to also implement sustainable urban mobility systems. Last week, we had the chance to interact with 2 speakers from Lagos and Kumasi who presented some of the measures that they have been implementing in their own city. It was particularly interesting because we could see different phases and different approaches on how to deal with the paratransit sector, how to enroll the operators, and how to conduct a reform on the sector. And today we would like to give you the floor to see how we could build together an approach and a strategy on how to better integrate and better reform the paratransit sector using some of the tools that are available in the Mobilise Your City Paratransit Toolkit. And to do so, we will have several learning objectives. First of all, of course, we will try to use the Paratransit Toolkit to assess the type of information that are needed before any action on the sector. And to do that, we will refer to the second tool and to the type of questions that can be useful to ask when conducting a diagnosis. Then we will try to figure out how to articulate a strategy regarding a reform of the paratransit sector and what kind of measures can be selected and implemented. And that will be the key, the core of the presentation today, to figure out how to hierarchize these different phases and actions to really build a sustainable approach and consistent approach to any action on the paratransit sector. To do so, we will have a three-phase approach in this webinar. We will first have an exercise that will lead us to map an ecosystem of stakeholders of the paratransit sector to really identify who is part of this ecosystem and what are the relationships between the different actors. In a second exercise, we will try to identify what questions we can ask if we want to conduct a diagnosis of the sector, and more specifically, the type of information that we would need to answer these questions and the data to be collected. Eventually, in a final exercise, we will try to elaborate a strategy to reform the paratransit sector, trying to use some of the actions that are listed in the Paratransit Toolkit. To do these exercises and to base our reflection on a tangible case study, I would like to take us into our fictional city that will be our ground for this morning's webinar. So this fictional city is located somewhere in Africa and shows some specific features that might recall you of some cities that you already know. In terms of governance, there is a local municipality which is in charge of the public transport regulation. However, the licenses are unregulated, which means there is no strict number of licenses being emitted, and there are no specifications linked to the licenses. And also, maybe not so much of a trivial information, the police gets very low wages. In terms of transport supply, most of the daily trips are provided by minibuses. But over the past years, we saw some motorcycle being more and more important and providing on-demand transport for the inhabitants. And there is no other mass rapid transit services yet. There was a bus public transport company, but it collapsed in the late 1980s. In terms of demand, we are located in a multi-millionaire city with a very fast-growing population. Most of the fast-growing population is located in the outskirts of the city, in the peripheral areas, where a lot of the rural population is currently immigrating, which leads to a very rapid sprawl of the urban area with quite high densities in the peripheral areas, which are almost connecting the peripheral cities. In terms of planning, there is a sustainable urban mobility plan that is soon to be implemented, and a BRT project has been in the conceiving phase. So not planned already, but currently being under study. So this is our fictional city. We will go back to these main features within the next exercises. So without transition, I would like to take you to our first exercise, which will be taking place on a mirror board within the next few seconds. And this first exercise will take us to try to identify, based on these characteristics, who could be the main stakeholders in the urban mobility ecosystem, and more specifically in the paratransit ecosystem, and more specifically, what could be the connections between those different stakeholders. So if you would like to elaborate a bit, so you're free to raise your hand if you want to speak or to comment in the chat box. And I would like to raise attention to the different groups of stakeholders you have. So for instance, in terms of paratransit operators, we have two different types of operators. We have the minibus operators and the motor taxi drivers. And in each case, we have subgroups, with some being the drivers of the vehicles and some being the owners of the vehicles. So would you be able, for instance, to try to figure out what is the connection between the drivers and the owner? Meaning, if we have to connect these actors with arrows, which direction would they be pointing at in terms of relationship, and more specifically in terms of financial stream, because that's also a main indicator of how the relationship is being directed. So if anyone would have an idea of how to connect these specific operators. I have my own idea, but I also don't want to be the only one chatting. So if you're also feeling particularly shy this morning, do not hesitate to use the chat box to comment and to try to figure out what could be the relationship between the different actors. But for instance, my guess would be that in the case of the drivers and the owners, the drivers are often asked to pay daily rent to the owner, meaning the money stream would be pointing from the driver towards the owner of the vehicle. And that would probably apply to both transport modes, meaning the minibuses and the motor taxis. But maybe another type of interaction we could also try to look at more precisely would be where is the main income coming from, meaning where is the main financial stream coming from. And that would also take us to one of the specificity of the paratransit sector, being that there are very limited financial resources. If any of the participants would have an idea, a guess on this one. Yes, Keisha is suggesting that the passengers are pairing directly to the drivers. And that's the interesting point, that most of the income generated in this sector actually result from the passengers' fare, which means that we, in the case of a very, very restricted income resource, and therefore a lot of pressure on the financial model of the stakeholders. So we have passengers paying directly the minibus drivers and the motor taxi drivers. The drivers themselves, if they do not own their own vehicle, then they are paying themselves the owners of the vehicle. But often, in the case of the minibuses, which means like collective, motorcycle can be collective as well, but more collective vehicles, we have another group of stakeholders that is being present, which is the crew that the drivers are asking to help them to manage the demand. So this means also that we have specific interaction between the drivers and the crews. This can be, when we talk about the crew, this can be the people dispatching the passengers, also some assistants helping the driver in navigating in the city, in interacting with other actors on the road, maybe the traffic officers, the other taxi drivers, or paratransit drivers. Then can you also figure out what would be the relationship between the drivers and the crew? If anyone else than Keisha would have an idea on this. Not really. So I would try to suggest that maybe the drivers have then to pay directly to the crew as well, and then use part of the income generated with the passenger fares to also distribute money to the crew. Then we have another type of interesting stakeholder that is quite specific as well to the paratransit sector, which are the professional bodies. These bodies tend to represent either the drivers or the owners of the vehicle, depending on the context. In some cities, they also represent both. And they also ask the operators to contribute to the functioning of the body itself, which means that we also have another type of interaction between the professional bodies and the operators, meaning that the drivers tend, and sometimes the owners, pay directly a membership fee to the professional bodies. So this is also another type of connection that we have. Also, some of you might know that in some specific cases, these relationships are not strictly organized, are not really transparent. And in some cases, those professional bodies also exert some power influence, especially on the drivers rather than on the owners, and ask some complementary uh, informal retribution to also have access, for instance, to privileged rank spaces, to in the stations or in the transport hubs, or also some protection, etc. So this is another type of connection that we can have, for instance, between, more particularly, the minibus drivers and the professional bodies, where in this specific case, it's more about the possible existence of informal financial flows that take the form of bribery that can be exerted by some of the professional bodies on the drivers. If you have other ideas, please feel free to comment on this on this illustration, and try to figure out what could be the other possible connection. Local authorities, of course, also play an important part in the sector. We mentioned a bit before that, especially in this fictional city, the licenses are unregulated. So it means that we also have possibly different types of connections. First, we will have connection with the drivers and the local authorities, with drivers paying to access the licenses, of course, which is a common situation. But maybe if in the case where there is a lack of regulation, this can also manifest through, here again, informal financial flows. So we can also have both type of flows. And also maybe to elaborate a bit more regarding those informal financial flows, a very common situation that is observed in some city is also to see some extortion or some pressure from the police force, especially as we mentioned initially, cases where the wages are very low. There are many cases that are being reported of bribery from the drivers towards the police force, maybe because some blockages would be implemented, and then drivers will have to pay to just pass the blockage made by the police force, or sometimes it would be also to also not get fines for, let's say, for instance, vehicle dysfunctions or repairs to be done. So this is also the kind of situation that can be that can take place, and that will also conduct to diverse type of financial flows within the ecosystem. And eventually, I would like also to take your attention to another specific setup, which is implemented that we can see in more and more cities nowadays, which is also the introduction of e-hailing platforms that enable to connect passengers with drivers. This is especially the case in two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So we see it mostly with motorcycles and tuk-tuks or rickshaws, for instance. It's very preliminary yet in the context of four-wheelers and minibuses, for instance. But this is also a new type of configuration that we see emerging, where passengers also do pay to have access to these e-hailing platforms, even though those platforms are for free. For the passengers, it does represent an expense in terms of access to data, for instance, to download the app on the cell phone, and also immaterial monetary value, such as also accepting to share some private information with these companies that are therefore afterwards using it to monetize other services. So there is this also a stream of revenue that is being generated lately, and the same applied to the drivers that also then become dependent on these new platforms. So this is mostly the case for motor taxi owners that will either subscribe to the platform or also be depending on these type of services to access passengers. So this is also a new type of connections that we can see emerging in the paratransit ecosystem. And in a nutshell, I mean, we're being very schematic in the way we are representing those interactions this morning. This is also just to give you an idea of the type of questions that can be asked when trying to understand how an ecosystem of actor is working, and before trying to address any issue in the paratransit sector, it's fundamental to understand who are the key players and what are the connections between them. And the specificity of the paratransit sector, of course, is the fact that some of these interactions can be easily identified, mostly, for instance, the type of interactions that connect the passengers with the drivers, with the local authorities, with the form of the licenses. But there are many hidden relationships as well, that also result from the very nature of the sector, but needs to be carefully understood and carefully considered when trying to understand how the system works and how it can be improved. So this is just a very brief example of the type of observation that can be done. You can find a similar example in the tool one of the Paratransit Toolkit, which will also feature different type of actors. Now we really concentrated on the drivers, the owners, professional bodies, and passengers, but you can also include much broader stakeholders, such as also all the peripheral actors, such as the energy suppliers, the mechanics, the insurers, that do have an impact, especially on the business model of the different stakeholders. I would like now to take you to the second exercise that we will present this morning, which will now take us to understand a bit better what kind of questions we can raise when we want to understand how is the paratransit sector organized and how it's working in a specific city. We understood during the past webinars that even though there are some very similar features in the paratransit sector in cities across the world, of course, each city has its own specificity. And it needs to be also here carefully considered to be really sure that any reform or action on the sector would be relevant and adapted. In the tool 2 of the Paratransit Toolkit, we suggest 6 general questions that can be asked prior to any action to try to understand how the system works and who are the people at play. Those 6 questions are presented here in the sticky notes. And for each question, I would like to try to identify with you the type of information that would be needed to answer the question and how to access the information. Because this is also a big challenge in the context of the paratransit sector to figure out how to collect data and to identify the relevant information to really understand how the system works. So a question to ask would be to understand what kind of mobility system we have. And this would take us to understand, for instance, several aspects. So, for instance, what are the operating principles that exist in the paratransit sector? If you have other ideas, please help me to fill in this table. I think that's a question that, that's one information that could be useful if we want to understand how is the system working, meaning how the operator is working, according to which rules they work. Maybe also we could try to understand what all the areas covered by the service. Maybe how many vehicles. So I leave it up to you to complement these ideas, maybe, and either to complement the ideas, but also if you would have suggestions on those specific information, what would be the sources that we could use? For instance, if we want to know how many vehicles are operating, or if we want to know what is the areas covered, what are the areas covered by the operators, where could we look to get this information? What type of data? Yes, thank you, Johan. So this is very interesting. Indeed, a basic information to get would be the model split. This is very important. The ownership structure as well, I think it's very relevant. This can be indeed a very important information to collect. For these questions, also we will also use it in the 4th question, which is related to the structure of the profession. Yeah, boarding and alighting data is very interesting. And do you have any suggestion on how we could collect this data? And I know we have some people, exactly. I was about to say, I know we have some people for Go Metro. So please, you can just give us a bit of insights on how it's possible to. So Go Metro app, but maybe more specifically, or not more generally, for cities who do not have the chance to have a Go Metro app available. What is what would be the tools and the data collection? Yes. So we can have onboard surveys, paper-based surveys. Another, yes, perfect. Rank counts, cordon counts, that's great. Another type of data could be, I'm thinking in terms of technical means, a very easy one that is being displayed. Authorities, yes. So Justin, maybe to generalize a bit, your comment, definitely authorities for secondary data. I would just regroup that with interviews, maybe. So we could have interviews with authorities. Maybe another type of interviews we could have would be directly with the operators themselves. And possibly as well with the passengers. And definitely also, Johan, you suggested camera tracking. Camera tracking is a really good tool to collect data. I was also thinking of GPS. We know that it's also a common device that is nowadays being used to collect data. I mean, all of that, of course, comes with its own bias and limitations. But this is just to brainstorm a bit on how we can get information when we want to understand a bit better how is the sector structured and organized. It's already quite a lot of possible sources. I think it's great. And also because we will have redundant sources, I would just suggest that we maybe move to the next question to ask, which would be how are the revenues collected and who bears the commercial risks? So in this second round of questions, we basically want to address the business models of the different stakeholders and how are these models understandable and how we can collect data on these business models. And for those of you who have already been involved on the topic, you know that it's a tricky point. So maybe if we want to enter a bit more this question, would you have ideas on either the type of information that we would need to collect to identify, or otherwise the type of data that can be collected to get the information? And also, my suggestion would be that we can also use some of the sources that you already mentioned to maybe also yes, exactly. So fleet size per owner, that's really important. That will give us information on what is the business model of the owners, the revenue collected. This is a big it's a big challenge. Also because, as we know, it's very difficult to get this information because in many cities, there is no tracking of the revenue collected. So it can be either collected through interviews, passenger interviews, drivers interviews, even though most of the time they try to minimize the revenue generated. As you mentioned, Johan, we can also sometimes rely on digital payment systems. And then I would say the artisanal way of doing things would be to collect the fares collected for each route, and then to also have an idea of what would be the amount of passengers on each route. But that means very ambitious survey programs and data collection. Yeah, just indeed identifying number of trips per day, number of passengers per trip, and average trip cost. And this is the traditional method. It's very long and costly to realize, but this is also so basically what we want to collect would be the revenue, the expenses also of the operators. All the related expenses, because when we talk about the expenses, often we think of the fuel price, we think of the maintenance, the repairs that are being done. An important aspect as well is, for instance, the insurance, also all the bribery related costs for the drivers, especially. So I think that's already quite a nice bunch of on information. Now, maybe we can move on to the third question, which would be, how is the sector regulated? And if we talk about regulation, some of the basic information that we try to collect most of the time would be, what is the route regulation? So who gets the right to operate on which route, and what are the areas covered by the services? How are the operators regulated? Yes. I think you're only relating to the business model thing, but it's definitely very relevant. Yes, exactly, Keisha. So who are the authorities in charge? How are the routes determined? How are the operators regulated? Another question would be also the fare regulation. Who's fixing the fares and for each route? In terms of data, a way to answer this question would be, for instance, to have an idea of what type of licenses are being emitted, or if there is any criteria of a number, like for instance, a fixed number of operators. We mentioned that in this fictional city, it's not the case. There are no quantitative criteria on the number of licenses emitted. Yes, where the government is involved as an operator is a really good point. I was thinking of the type of license. Also, a very important issue or information to collect would be if there are any criteria for license renewals. Vehicle regulation, yes. This is also a good point. In terms of safety, in terms of amount of seats, for instance, air quality standards, which becomes also a more and more crucial topic. Perfect. And just to move on to the also how to collect the data. So if you would have any suggestion of, for instance, where to and how to get information on the licenses emitted, which is also a big I think you're a bit anticipating already when you're mentioning phasing out of paratransit to introduce BRT in the future. That might be one of the options, but maybe not the only option. But that will be discussed in the exercise 3. So yeah, interview with a licensing authority and operators. In many cities, there is a record of the licenses that are being emitted, even when there is no regulation. So that can be also an important source of information. Of course, interviews are always a really good way to get information. In this specific case, also the legislative framework to also understand what are the legal specifications, even though in many cases enforcement can be an option. Can be a problem. Going back to the legislative framework can be a really good indicator also to understand the approach that is being privileged or maybe to move on to the other questions. We might not complete all questions because this is very much, we cannot be completely exhaustive on this board, but regarding the management rules in the profession, as I mentioned before, the professional bodies are a very important feature in this sector. So it's important to also understand how they work and how they are structured and the type of relationship that can exist between the different actors, such as the operators, the drivers, the professional bodies. So for that, it's really important to understand the role of professional bodies, then to collect information on this. Most of the time, interviews are the key source of information. Also, observation shouldn't be underestimated, to be present in the stations, in the hubs, and see how the fleet management is being organized, how the different stakeholders are interacting with one another is a very important way to get to understand a bit better how the sector is structured. And a very important aspect that we also touched on in the previous exercise is really to understand who pays what, including also all the informal streams. And I will move eventually to the fifth question. I think the sixth question is also maybe a bit more general, but the fifth question is really important, and I would like to really mention it with you this morning, is what role do the users play? Because in all this sector, we see that the users are a key player because they are generating the only source of income for an incredible amount of stakeholders. However, they often tend to be undermined or minimized in the way the sector works. So an important, of course, information is to understand what is the demand. So how many people are using paratransit services? Then it's of course also very interesting to figure out what is the profile of the demand, and especially if we, in the context of captive passengers, or people that do choose to use paratransit services. What are the conditions of mobility for the people using the paratransit services? What is the elasticity of the demand to also understand if people would be willing to pay more for better service quality, etc. And all this information can be accessed either in some cases when it exists through household surveys, but this is also very not very rare, but it's also not the case in every city, especially not necessarily in secondary city. So for that, again, passenger interviews are often the best way to have access to this information. Observation and embarked trips are a good way to get access to this type of data as well. I'm not going to elaborate much more on this because you will find many other examples of type of sources to be used in the tool 2 of the Paratransit Toolkit to understand how to get information on those 6 questions. You can see that in the annex of the tool too. But I thank you all the participants who did share some very precious insights, and as you can see, there is no one type of source of information, but it's really by crossing sources and collection methods that we can try to fill in the puzzle of what is the paratransit sector. I will invite you now to move to the third exercise this morning that will take us to 3 different breakout rooms where we will be trying together to identify steps for possible reform of the paratransit sector in our fictional case study city. So please do not stay connected. That will be done automatically. And you will have the chance to meet my colleagues, Milnail and Nicolas, in the 2 other rooms. And they will take you to the different mirror boards. So I just wanted to say for a final debrief on this session. So the point was just to give an overview of, first of all, the type of measures that are presented in the Paratransit Toolkit tool number 3. And of course, I mean, it's obvious that we cannot agree on a consistent reform in such a short time, but this toolkit. I hope this was interesting for you all. And if you have any question, please do not hesitate to reach out to us, either using the chat box now, also by giving us feedback through the feedback form that is accessible on the QR code that is on the screen now or in the chat box. All your comments are really helping us to improve the different sessions and the different series of webinars that are being offered by MobiliseYourCity. So please take 2 minutes to answer this form. We will be also sharing more information either on this topic or also on all the other related activities on MobiliseYourCity. If you would like to have more information, you're welcome to go and check MobiliseYourCity website. You can also subscribe to MobiliseYourCity newsletter to be tuned on all the different activities implemented. And there will be another event organized in November in the context of the Climate Change Week. So you can also join us on the 6th of November. I will thank you all for this participation to this series of webinars. That was the last one of the series dedicated to the Paratransit Toolkit. Now you know what is in this toolkit, so feel free to go and check it out and use it as much as possible in your own context and in your own city. Thank you all, and looking forward to meeting you in other circumstances. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. See you.